Billionaire dared Black Waitress to play the piano. Her first note made the room explode. Sometimes, the most beautiful music comes from the most overlooked hands. She wasn't dressed in silk or diamonds, just an apron and quiet dignity. But when the billionaire dared her to sit at the piano, her first note carried not just sound, but a story the whole room would never forget. Before we begin, let me ask you this. Have you ever witnessed a simple act reveal a person's true worth? Share your story in the comments. I'd be honored to read it. And if you believe every hidden gift deserves its moment, tap the like button so more people can feel this too. The night gleamed with a kind of brightness only wealth could purchase. Chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above the marble expanse of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, scattering gold across gowns stitched in Paris and tuxedos pressed to perfection. A string quartet whispered in one corner, their bows moving like clockwork, offering background elegance to the conversations that mattered more than the music itself. At the entrance, cameras flashed like fireworks as guests in diamonds and tailored suits paraded down the carpet, waving as if generosity were their second skin. Tonight was Richard Whitmore's annual charity gala, a spectacle more about reputation than relief. On paper, it was for hospitals, schools, and opportunity programs. In reality, it was about alliances, shareholders, and photo spreads in glossy magazines. And somewhere in that glossy world, there were hands that polished the marble, hands that replaced champagne flutes before they were empty, hands that opened doors without being seen. Those hands belonged to people like Elena Brooks. Elena balanced a silver tray with steady precision, weaving between clusters of donors. At 32, she had mastered invisibility. Her uniform, black skirt, crisp white blouse, hair tied back neatly, was designed to erase her, to make her a moving fixture rather than a person. Even her shoes whispered across the floor, polished but soft-soled, the kind that never announce arrival. She placed a glass on the table beside a portly gentleman deep in conversation about oil stocks. He didn't glance up, didn't thank her. That was expected. Elena wasn't here to be acknowledged. She was here to serve. But inside her, something always stirred when the music drifted across the room. The quartet's harmony curled through the air, brushing a part of her that had once lived on notes and measures. Her fingers, free for just a second, tapped an invisible rhythm against the edge of the tray. Then she stopped, reminding herself, not here, not now. From across the ballroom, Gloria, the senior housekeeper with streaks of gray in her hair, caught her eye. Gloria gave a small, knowing nod, a silent reminder. Keep your head down, sweetheart. The less they see, the safer you are. Elena returned a polite half-smile. Staff, stay out of photo line. A PR assistant muttered briskly, walking past with a clipboard. The words weren't aimed at her directly. But Elena felt them land anyway, another rule carved into marble of this place. She adjusted her position, circling around the clusters of people, making sure her uniform never intruded into the camera's frame. Near the grand staircase, two young women in sequin dresses paused, waiting for a photographer to finish with another group. One noticed Elena passing. She tilted her chin, lips curling slightly, as though the sight of a waitress so close to the velvet rope was offensive. "Excuse me," she said with a sweetness sharpened into steel. "Could you wait in the back until we're done?" Elena dipped her head. "Of course, ma'am." Her voice was steady, stripped of inflection, the way she'd learned to speak in these halls. As she turned away, a businessman chuckled under his breath. They always forget their place. The words weren't even meant for her ears, but they struck nonetheless. Elena inhaled, let it settle, then exhaled out again. To survive here, she had taught herself, you had to let insults float like smoke. You couldn't hold on to every sting. Still, she couldn't help remembering another life. The faint scent of varnished wood, the cool ivory of piano keys, the applause of a recital hall that had once whispered her name. Elena Brooks, rising star. But that was more than a decade ago. That life had been traded for hospital bills, night shifts, and uniforms like this one. The clink of a glass pulled her back. She moved quickly, catching a champagne flute before it tipped off the edge of a table. A guest looked up briefly, startled, then said, Good catch. The praise was casual, fleeting. Elena simply nodded and moved on. She passed by the grand piano station at the far end of the hall, a Steinway with its polished lid catching the chandelier's light. The sight of it made her pause. Her tray tilted ever so slightly as her mind reached backward to evenings when her mother would hum gospel hymns in their small living room while Elena practiced scales, dreaming of concert halls. She steadied herself. That door was locked now. She had promised herself not to ache for it. Elena! Gloria's voice cut softly across the bustle. She appeared with a small bottle of water, discreetly slipping it onto Elena's tray. Take a sip when you can. Long night ahead. Elena's eyes softened. Thanks, Miss Gloria. I'm all right. You always say that. Gloria's gaze lingered, a mixture of affection and worry. Then she shuffled away, her posture bent but her presence formidable, the kind of woman who had endured decades in these gilded rooms without ever truly belonging to them. At the edge of the ballroom, a pair of security guards scanned the staff moving about, their eyes trained not on threats but on boundaries. They weren't hostile, exactly, just watchful, as though the very presence of someone like Elena near the donors required monitoring. One of them followed her movements for several steps before turning away. Elena swallowed. She had lived this routine long enough to recognize the silent language. You don't belong here, but we'll allow you as long as you stay in your lane. She returned to her route, delivering glasses, replacing napkins, slipping out away before anyone had to notice her. She was a shadow with a name badge, and most of the time, no one cared enough to read it. But in the air tonight, under the glitter and the speeches, Elena felt something else simmering, something restless, as if the room itself was waiting for a moment, one that would turn the carefully scripted evening upside down. And at the center of that storm to be was a man who had built this empire of glass and light, the billionaire Richard Whitmore, whose very presence pulled every gaze like gravity. The night, Elena thought fleetingly, was far from over. The orchestra in the corner played a soft interlude, their strings weaving a polite fabric of sound that no one truly listened to. Guests clinked glasses, their laughter rising like smoke, oblivious to the silent current of workers who flowed beneath the surface of the night. For Elena Brooks, the rhythm of the gala was as familiar as breathing. Move left before the tray collides. Step back before the photo flash. Pivot just enough so the donor doesn't notice the stain forming on his cuff. She had mastered this dance. Not the one under the chandelier, but the one at the edges, invisible and precise. She delivered a flute of champagne to a young couple near the center. The man barely glanced at her, but the woman adjusted her dress with a flick of her wrist and muttered, "Careful, don't smudge." Elena smiled politely, as if the words weren't meant as a barb. Then she turned away, letting the noise of the ballroom swallow her. At the far end of the hall, another server stumbled slightly, nearly colliding with a guest. The man barked, "Watch it, will you?" His hand tightened on his wine glass, and though no spill had occurred, his glare lingered as though the young server had committed a crime. Elena stepped in smoothly, offering a fresh glass before the moment could escalate. "Thank you," the guest said, not to her, but to the fact that the interruption was resolved. Elena nodded anyway, sliding back into the current. Gloria appeared at her side, steady as ever. The older woman's hair, streaked silver, framed a face that had weathered decades of nights just like this. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen everything and survived it. "You move like smoke, child," Gloria murmured, passing a stack of folded napkins into Elena's tray. "In and out before they even know you were there." Elena offered a faint smile. "That's the job, isn't it?" Gloria's eyes softened, but her voice carried a weight. "That's the survival. Don't confuse the two." Elena wanted to ask more, but a PR assistant swept past with a sharp gesture. "Staff, please, out of the camera line." His voice wasn't harsh, just mechanical, like a rule enforced 1,000 times without thought. "Yes, sir," Elena replied evenly, though no one looked back to hear it. She adjusted her route again, circling around the cameras, skirting the edge of the dance floor. She noticed how often the staff were redirected. Not because they were doing wrong, but because their presence was considered a blemish against the curated image of elegance. At one table, a group of businessmen discussed stocks between sips of whiskey. One of them glanced at Elena as she refilled their glasses. Funny, isn't it? We talk millions and they earn pennies. The others chuckled. The words weren't cruel in tone, but casual, as if poverty and service were punchlines, not lives. Elena's hand was steady as she poured. Would you like a refill, sir? Her voice was calm, controlled. Sure, the man said, without ever looking her in the eye. She turned away, her expression composed. But inside, she heard her mother's voice, the one that used to guide her through long nights of practice at their old upright piano. Dignity is not about who sees you, Lena. It's about who you are when no one is watching. She held on to that now, letting it steady her breath. Across the room, a young busboy, barely 20, was scolded by a guest for clearing a plate too soon. His cheeks flushed, his hands trembled. Elena passed by, catching his eye just long enough to give him a small nod of reassurance. The boy straightened, shoulders lifting slightly as he returned to work. Moments like these mattered. They were invisible to donors, invisible to the cameras, but they were the threads that held dignity together in a world determined to strip it away. Miss Brooks, Gloria said again later, catching her near the service door. You've been on your feet 3 hours straight. Drink. She pressed a water bottle into Elena's hand. Elena hesitated, then took a small sip. Thank you. Don't thank me, Gloria replied, her tone sharp but affectionate. Thank yourself for lasting this long without breaking. This place, it doesn't make it easy for us to keep our heads high. Elena's gaze drifted back to the Steinway at the far end of the room. Its polished surface reflected the chandeliers like captured stars. She felt the ache rise again, the one she tried so hard to keep buried. The memory of scales, of chords, of her teacher's voice. Silence is also a note. Elena, don't be afraid of it. She blinked the memory away. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about keeping glasses full and smiles unbroken. But fate, she suspected, had a way of rewriting scripts. For now, she carried on, quiet and unseen, the very embodiment of invisible hands and quiet dignity. The storm, however, was already gathering on the horizon of the night. The air in the grand ballroom shifted long before he appeared. Conversation softened, laughter thinned into polite murmurs, and the orchestra, almost instinctively, slowed their tempo. It was as if the walls themselves knew who was about to enter. Richard Whitmore did not need an introduction. His presence always traveled faster than his footsteps. The double doors of the far end opened, and he strode in, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the measured assurance of a man who owned more than half the room and believed the rest should be grateful to be near him. He was tall, shoulders square beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His silver cufflinks caught the chandelier light like tiny bursts of authority. His hair, black streaked with dignified gray, was combed immaculately back. But it wasn't his attire that commanded attention. It was his gaze, sharp and unapologetic, sweeping the room as though appraising everything in it. Cameras turned like sunflowers following the sun. Flashes burst. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Half admiration, half awe. To many here, he wasn't just a man. He was the gatekeeper to fortunes, opportunities, and influence. Elena, Gloria murmured under her breath, nudging her discreetly. The king has arrived. Elena glanced up from the tray of crystal glasses she balanced effortlessly. Her eyes locked briefly on the man across the hall. He was magnetic, yes, but not in the way people imagined. To her, the power he wielded was more suffocating than dazzling. Whitmore paused mid-room, allowing the attention to cascade around him. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that was not a wave but an acceptance of their deference. His entourage hovered nearby, an advisor, a young assistant carrying a tablet, and two men who looked more like bodyguards than guests. The master of ceremonies, practically glowing with excitement, rushed forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight's distinguished host, Mr. Richard Whitmore. Applause erupted, scattered at first, then swelling into a roar. Guests rose to their feet. Some clapped as though each strike of their palms might earn them a favor. Elena and the other staff had been trained to keep moving, even during such interruptions. But as Whitmore moved toward the grand staircase at the front, his path cut directly across hers. She stepped aside quickly, bowing her head as was habit. But he noticed her, not as a person, but as an obstacle. "Watch where you stand," he said, his tone clipped, not cruel but dismissive, as though she were a misplaced chair. His hand barely flicked toward her tray, steadying it with a touch that felt more like command than courtesy. "Of course, sir," Elena murmured, steadying her balance. Her voice was calm, but inside, a flicker of indignation stirred. Whitmore had already moved on, his attention fixed on the piano at the far end of the ballroom. The Steinway, polished perfection, gleamed under the chandeliers. He smiled faintly, a smile that seemed rehearsed. "Tonight," he declared, as microphones caught his voice, "we celebrate not just wealth, but vision. We celebrate the spirit of ambition, the belief that with enough drive, the impossible bends to our will." The guests applauded again, their faces shining with practiced admiration. Elena continued her work, weaving through tables, but her ears caught every syllable. His words about ambition stung, not because they were wrong, but because they rang hollow when spoken by a man who had never needed to survive invisibility. Whitmore gestured toward the piano. "As you know, music has always been a part of my family's legacy. Tonight, I've invited a guest pianist to honor that tradition, a talent whose fingers speak a language finer than words." A young man in a tuxedo approached the stage, his stride confident, his smile self-assured. The applause swelled again, but Elena felt her chest tighten. She recognized the look in the pianist's eyes, the look of someone certain the world already belonged to him. As the young man bowed, Whitmore's gaze swept the crowd again, briefly touching on Elena's corner of the room. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. He didn't linger. He looked past her as one might glance at a curtain or a candelabra. To him, she was not invisible because he didn't see her. She was invisible because he didn't believe she mattered. Gloria noticed Elena's tightened jaw. "Keep your head, child," she whispered. "Men like him, they want you to forget who you are. Don't let him." Elena exhaled slowly, focusing on the tray in her hands. She thought again of her mother's words, of the quiet dignity she tried to carry. But in that moment, as Whitmore claimed the room with a voice that turned applause into currency, she felt a storm begin to build inside her, because storms often begin not with thunder, but with silence. And Richard Whitmore, in all his power and presence, had no idea that his words, his arrogance, and his dismissal had already struck the first chord of the night's reckoning. The pianist's fingers danced across the keys, a ripple of sound filling the grand hall. Guests swayed slightly, sipping champagne, eyes half closed as if savoring the notes was proof of refinement. Richard Whitmore stood near the piano, a glass of brandy in hand, nodding as though he were both patron and critic of the arts. His voice carried easily over the melody, seasoned with the weight of authority. "Talent," he announced, "is a rare thing, but when paired with discipline and the right stage, it becomes destiny. Of course, most people never even touch that stage." Laughter bubbled politely from those closest to him. They weren't laughing at a joke, but at the invitation to agree. Elena moved quietly among the guests, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates. Her every motion was precise, practiced, unnoticeable. Yet tonight, invisibility felt heavier than usual. Whitmore's words pressed against her chest, echoing her own hidden truth. That talent without opportunity was like a flame under glass, smothered before it could breathe. As the applause of the pianist rose again, Whitmore's gaze swept the room, catching Elena just as she set a tray on a nearby table. He paused. A small, amused smile curled on his lips. "You there," he said suddenly. The room stilled. Dozens of eyes pivoted toward Elena. Her fingers froze around a glass stem. "Yes, you," Whitmore repeated, lifting his glass in her direction. "What's your name?" Elena steadied herself. "Elena, sir. Elena." He rolled the name on his tongue, as if testing its weight. "Tell me, Elena, do you enjoy music?" Her throat tightened. She nodded carefully. "Yes, sir." A chuckle rippled to the front rows of guests. Whitmore tilted his head, savoring the moment like a cat toying with prey. "You look like someone who hums while working," he said, voice smooth but edged. "Am I right? Perhaps while scrubbing floors or carrying trays?" Polite laughter fluttered across the room. Elena felt heat climb her neck. Whitmore tapped the rim of his glass. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, That's the beauty of these gatherings. We have brilliance on the stage, he gestured to the pianist, and service in the aisles. Each plays their part. The pianist smiled faintly, his fingers resting on the keys, waiting for the next cue. Gloria, watching from the side, whispered through gritted teeth, "Don't let him bait you, child. Just keep your dignity." But Whitmore wasn't finished. His smile sharpened, his words deliberate. "Of course, one wonders," he let the pause linger. "What separates the ones up here from the ones down there? Is it birth? Fortune? Or perhaps simply skill?" He turned fully toward Elena now, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Tell me, Elena, can you play?" The air thickened. Guests leaned forward, some already suppressing grins. Elena's lips parted, but no words came. Whitmore chuckled, filling the silence himself. "No, don't be shy. I'm sure you've tapped a few keys in a church basement or a dingy bar, yes? Or perhaps you sing into your mop when no one's listening." Laughter burst louder this time, less restrained. A few guests even clapped lightly, enjoying the spectacle. Elena's chest burned, but her voice, steady though quiet, finally emerged. "I can play, sir." The laughter faltered, surprise cutting through. Whitmore's brows rose, then lowered into amusement. "Is that so?" "Yes." She met his eyes, calm but unyielding. The room crackled with tension. Some guests whispered, their curiosity suddenly piqued. Whitmore swirled the brandy in his glass, savoring the moment. "Well, then, this is fate, isn't it? A gala, a piano, an audience, and our waitress with hidden talents." He raised his voice so the entire hall could hear. "Shall we put her claim to the test?" The applause came first from the boldest guests, then spread like fire. "Yes, let her play." Elena's heart thudded in her chest. She hadn't touched a grand piano in years. She hadn't even spoken aloud about her skill since the day her dreams had been packed away behind bills and responsibilities. Whitmore stepped aside, gesturing to the instrument with exaggerated flourish. "There it is. Elena, the stage is yours. If you can play something worthy of this hall," he paused, then smirked, "I'll double your month's wages." Imagine that. Extra tips without lifting another tray. The laughter roared again, but beneath it pulsed an eagerness. The crowd wasn't just entertained. They wanted to see her fail. Elena inhaled deeply. Gloria's voice rang in her ear. "Don't let him bait you." But this was more than bait. It was a line drawn in the marble floor, a challenge that burned too bright to ignore. She set her tray down carefully, hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of decision. Then she straightened her back, smoothed her apron, and said clearly enough for all to hear, "I'll play." The room gasped. Some clapped. Some jeered. Others leaned forward in hungry anticipation. Whitmore's smirk widened. "Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves. Tonight, we are not just witnesses to fine music. We are witnesses to courage." He turned back to Elena, his voice dropping low enough only she could hear. "Don't disappoint me, Miss Brooks. Or rather, do, so we can all laugh about it later." Elena's hands curled into fists, then released. She walked toward the Steinway, each step heavy with the knowledge that this was no longer about entertainment. It was about dignity. And dignity, once challenged, demanded an answer. The laughter still echoed faintly as Elena walked toward the piano, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The crowd's energy was electric, the kind of restless anticipation usually reserved for sporting events or scandalous gossip. Everyone expected the same ending. Humiliation, a quick stumble, another servant put in her place. Whitmore leaned back, folded his arms across his chest, eyes glinting with smug delight. He whispered to the guest beside him, loud enough for others to hear, "Watch closely. This is going to be fun." Elena paused before the Steinway Grand, her reflection rippling across its glossy black surface. Her heart hammered like a drumline, but her face held calm resolve. She reached out and let her fingertips hover above the keys, so close she could feel the coolness of ivory without touching it. The room fell silent. It was the kind of silence that had weight, pressing down on everyone equally. Waiters froze mid-step. Guests leaned in. Even the chandelier crystals seemed to stop their shimmering dance, as though time itself wanted to hear what would happen next. For Elena, the silence was a mirror. She saw in it every moment she had been dismissed, every dream she had buried under endless shifts and unpaid bills. She saw her mother's tired hands, her father's quiet sighs, her own younger self whispering, "You were meant for more." She exhaled. Then she played. The first note rang out, clear, resonant, unshakable. Not hesitant, not clumsy. It filled the hall like a single drop of rain in a desert, shocking in its purity. Gasps fluttered across the room. Her hands moved again, and suddenly the silence cracked open into melody. Not the stumbling amateur performance they had expected. Not the awkward fumbling of a waitress pretending to be more than she was. But music. Real music. Her fingers glided with confidence, weaving chords as if the piano had been waiting for her all its life. Each note struck not just the strings, but the very air itself, vibrating into the bones of those who listened. Guests leaned forward, disbelief etched on their faces. The pianist who had entertained them earlier now watched with his mouth slightly open, his hands folded, as though in reverence. Whitmore's smirk faltered. Elena played a progression that shifted from gentle to commanding, her body swaying subtly with the rhythm. She wasn't just playing, she was conversing, telling a story that words could never hold. The laughter that had been poised to erupt died in the throats of the guests. Instead, an uncanny stillness swept the room, pierced only by the growing power of her music. It was Chopin at first, delicate yet firm, rippling like water under moonlight. Then, seamlessly, she transitioned into something jazzier, more playful, notes skipping like sparks. Her versatility was undeniable. Every chord seemed to peel back a layer of who she was. The daughter of a choir singer, the girl who once dreamed of Juilliard, the woman who now carried trays in silence. And now, the hidden truth, laid bare before a room that had never thought to see her. The air shifted. Shoulders dropped. Eyes softened. It was as if the hall itself had forgotten it was a place where ridicule and wealth had become, for a few brief moments, a sanctuary of revelation. One guest whispered, "My God, she's extraordinary." Another clutched her pearls, unable to look away. Whitmore's hand tightened around his glass. He had expected entertainment, not exposure. This wasn't his script. He was losing control of the stage, and the stage was everything to him. Elena, oblivious to his unraveling, leaned deeper into the keys, letting her music swell. Her eyes closed, not to escape, but to immerse. She wasn't proving anything to Whitmore anymore. She wasn't even playing for the guests. She was playing for herself. And in that moment, she was free. The crescendo built like a storm gathering over the sea. Tension hung in the air, so thick it seemed the very chandeliers trembled. Then, with a grace that only mastery allows, she resolved it in a cascade of notes that shimmered like falling stars. The final chord rang out, deep, resonant, unwavering. Silence. Not the expectant silence of before, but stunned silence. Heavy, reverent. Then, like a wave breaking, applause erupted. It wasn't polite applause, the kind offered at charity galas to maintain appearances. It was thunderous, raw, desperate to release the emotion that had just been bottled inside them. Guests stood, clapping harder, some even cheering. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. The pianist bowed his head, humbled. Whitmore remained frozen, his jaw set, his pride cracked. He lifted his glass to his lips, but his hand trembled, the brandy sloshing faintly. Elena opened her eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream. She rose from the piano bench, her back straight, her expression serene. The applause swelled again, rolling across the hall like a tide. For the first time in years, Elena felt seen, not as a waitress, not as invisible labor, but as who she truly was. She met Whitmore's gaze across the room. His smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to name. Shock, yes, but also fear. Fear of losing control, of being outshone by someone he had deemed insignificant. She didn't need to say a word. The music had spoken for her. And in that silence between them, the balance of power shifted. Forever. The last echo of Elena's final chord lingered like perfume in the air. For a moment no one moved, as if afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile spell she had cast. Then, almost hesitantly, the applause began again, soft at first, then swelling into something unstoppable. It was not applause for a novelty. It was not the forced courtesy of the wealthy. It was a kind of ovation that comes from awe, the kind that transforms a gathering into witnesses of something sacred. One by one, people rose from their seats. A standing ovation. Some clapped with eyes wide in disbelief, as though they couldn't quite reconcile the woman in the plain black and white uniform of the virtuoso who had just commanded the piano. Others clapped with tears in their eyes, struck by the realization that they had nearly missed greatness hidden in plain sight. The maitre d', who had once barked at Elena to hurry, now found himself clapping furiously, his face flushed with shame and pride all at once. One of the waiters muttered under his breath, "That's our girl," his voice thick with emotion. The other staff, usually in visible shadows in the grand hall, exchanged glances. For years they had walked softly, swallowed insults, and endured. Now one of their own stood at the center, not as a servant, but as a star. They clapped harder, louder, their dignity rising with hers. At a table near the front, a silver-haired woman leaned over to her companion. "Do you hear it? Do you feel it?" She played as if she's lived 100 lives. "Yes," the companion whispered back, eyes fixed on Elena, as if the piano has always been hers. But the most striking transformation was not in the guests' applause. It was in their eyes. Where moments before there had been condescension, mockery, or indifference, now there was recognition, respect, even admiration. Some looked embarrassed, glancing down as if ashamed of the things they had muttered when she first approached the piano. A few men shifted uncomfortably, their arrogance pierced by the truth of her talent. The women in gowns, who had dismissed her as little more than furniture, now looked at her with quiet reverence, as if acknowledging a queen they had overlooked. And then there was Whitmore. Richard Whitmore sat frozen in his chair, his glass of brandy untouched, the ice melting silently. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered, not just with anger, but with something far more dangerous for a man like him, uncertainty. He had built his empire on control. Every deal, every gala, every conversation had been carefully orchestrated to bend toward him. And yet here, in his own ballroom, he had lost control. The script had slipped from his hands. Worse, it had been stolen by a waitress. Elena stood by the piano, still catching her breath. She didn't bask in the applause. She didn't bow theatrically or revel in the attention. She simply stood with quiet dignity, her hands folded in front of her, her head held high. That restraint only magnified the room's respect. It was as though her silence spoke louder than any boast could. "I don't need to demand your approval. I already earned it." A few guests broke away from their tables and approached her. A music professor from Columbia, with spectacles sliding down his nose, stammered, "Miss, forgive me, but do you teach? Do you perform? Because if not, the world is being robbed." Another guest, a renowned philanthropist, leaned on her cane as she spoke. "Child, you reminded me tonight of something I'd forgotten, that true beauty comes not from status, but from soul." Each voice, each gesture chipped away at the invisible walls that had long surrounded Elena. In the far corner, the professional pianist who had earlier entertained the crowd stood with his arms crossed. At first, pride bristled in his posture. But then, slowly, he began to clap too, steady, deliberate, acknowledging that he had just heard someone whose gift transcended rivalry. Whitmore's knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass. He forced a smile, but it was brittle, unconvincing. When a guest beside him said, "Remarkable, isn't she?" he replied with a flat chuckle, Yes, remarkable indeed. A lucky trick, I suppose." But his words sounded hollow, and everyone knew it. Elena turned, her eyes sweeping across the room. She met the gaze of the staff clustered in the shadows and gave them the smallest nod, a gesture that said, "This was for all of us." Their faces lit up. For the first time in years, they felt pride not only in her, but in themselves. She had cracked the glass ceiling above them, even if just for one night, and they could all breathe freer because of it. The respect in the room grew heavier, denser, until it pressed against Whitmore himself. He shifted uncomfortably, his throne-like chair now feeling like a cage. For once, the billionaire was not the axis around which the room spun. The room now revolved around Elena, and though she stood silently, She held more power in that moment than Whitmore had ever commanded with all his wealth. The thunder of applause still echoed in the ballroom, but Richard Whitmore heard it as something else entirely. To him, it wasn't admiration, it was betrayal. These were his guests, people who owed him favors, contracts, invitations. Their applause was supposed to belong to him, yet tonight it had been stolen by a waitress. He sat stiffly, his face locked in a mask of aristocratic calm, but his chest burned. Each clap of their hands felt like a slap across his cheek. Each standing ovation was a reminder that he was no longer the center of gravity in his own empire. Inside, his mind turned chaotic. How did this happen? He thought. How did a maid, a nobody, reduce me to a spectator in my own kingdom? He tightened his grip on his glass, staring at the amber liquid inside as though it could anchor him. But it didn't. His reflection in the glass looked distorted, hollow, like a man suddenly aware of his own fragility. From the corner of his eye, he saw his board members whisper into each other, their eyes shining not with deference to him but with admiration for Elena. He saw the mayor's wife lean forward, calling Elena's performance the soul of the evening. And he saw his rivals, men who had given anything to watch him stumble, smiling smugly, as though fate had just handed them a gift. His authority was cracking, and worst of all, he knew it. Richard had built his reputation on unshakable control. In business, in politics, in society, he was a man who dictated the rhythm of the room. He silenced opponents with a glance, bought loyalty with checks, bent narratives with his sheer presence. But tonight, his power had failed him. Worse yet, it wasn't another billionaire who had done it. Not a politician, not a competitor. It was a woman he hadn't even bothered to see when she served him wine. His mind raced for a way out. He thought of dismissing her talent as a parlor trick. He thought of ridiculing the audience for being swept away by sentiment. He even thought, fleetingly, of standing and reclaiming the room with one of his infamous speeches. But deep down, he knew none of it would work. He had witnessed her gift, and so had they. The more he fought it, the more the truth mocked him. Elena hadn't stolen the room. She had earned it. That realization dug at him like claws. Because for Richard, respect was a currency bought and sold. It was calculated, transactional. But what Elena had shown was something else entirely. Something that couldn't be purchased or bent. Authenticity. The thought terrified him. He glanced at Elena again. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even smiling. She stood calmly, her uniform plain, her hands folded, her eyes steady. And that composure cut him deeper than any boast could have. She doesn't even care if I approve of her, he realized. She doesn't need me. And for a man like Richard Whitmore, that was the most dangerous truth of all. His inner world grew darker. Voices of doubt long suppressed began to stir. He remembered his father's voice, harsh, unyielding, telling him as a boy, control the room or be controlled. For decades he had lived by that creed. But tonight, control was slipping. Around him, his staff hovered nervously. His assistant leaned closer, whispering, "Sir, perhaps we should invite her too." Richard silenced him with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. But even as he silenced his aide, he knew the suggestion had merit. If he didn't claim Elena somehow, by offering her a contract, by tying her to his empire, she would walk out of here as a legend, and his name would forever be tethered to her humiliation of him. Tie her down, he thought. Reclaim the narrative before it's too late. But another voice whispered inside him, quieter yet stronger. You can't own her. That's why she terrifies you. For the first time in years, Richard felt small, vulnerable. And though no one else could hear his inner war, it showed in subtle cracks. The twitch of his jaw, the stiffness in his posture, the forced smile that faltered under the weight of sincerity in the room. The people closest to him noticed. One of his allies, a senator, leaned back with narrowed eyes, as if reevaluating the man he thought untouchable. His chief rival, seated across the hall, smirked knowingly, sensing weakness like blood in the water. The cracks were visible now. And Richard Whitmore, billionaire, titan, master control, realized that he was bleeding authority in the one place he could not afford it, his own sanctuary. The applause that once felt like his crown now thundered like a judgment. And somewhere deep inside him, a new and unfamiliar fear stirred. What if they never see me the same again? The applause ebbed, leaving in its wake a charged silence. The chandelier light glimmered off crystal glasses, and every eye in the ballroom shifted, not toward Richard Whitmore, the billionaire host, but toward the woman standing calmly by the piano. Elena didn't bask in the attention. She didn't bow or smile as if she had conquered something. Instead, she simply stood, shoulders squared, her hands folded in front of her apron. It was her quiet dignity that made the silence deeper, more profound. And then, in that silence, Richard rose. The scraping of his chair echoed louder than the applause had moments ago. His movements were precise, deliberate, but everyone saw the stiffness in them. The effort of a man trying to appear in control when control was already gone. "Elena," he said, his voice booming but strained, "a surprising performance." Some guests shifted uncomfortably. They heard the hollowness beneath the words. Compliments, yes, but wrapped in reluctance, dripping with ego. Elena's gaze met his. Steady, calm. Her expression carried no resentment, no smugness, only clarity. That alone unnerved him more than 1,000 accusations. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, her tone even respectful. Yet something about the way she said it made the title sound less like reverence and more like a reminder of his smallness in this moment. Richard cleared his throat. Talent should never go unnoticed. Perhaps I might extend an offer. I have contacts, contracts. With the right stage, the right guidance, your name could travel beyond these walls. Would you be interested? It was his attempt to reclaim the narrative. If he could tie her to him, claim her success as something he had discovered, then perhaps he could erase the sting of humiliation. But Elena tilted her head slightly, her lips curving, not into a smile, but into something quieter, sharper. "I didn't play for contracts," she said softly. "I didn't play for a stage. I played because you dared me to prove my worth." Her words cut through the air like a bell tolling. "You see, Mr. Whitmore, my worth was never yours to measure. Not tonight, not ever." The ballroom froze. A collective breath held. For the older guests, the patrons, the veterans of boardrooms and politics, the weight of those words landed heavy, because they knew what it meant to live in a world where worth was measured in power and money. And they also knew how rare it was for someone to reject that measurement entirely. Richard's face hardened. "You think a speech will change the way this world works?" Elena stepped forward just one pace, and it was enough to shift the center of gravity in the room. "No," she said, her voice steady, "but it can change the way people see it. Tonight, they saw you try to diminish someone who served you, and they saw that same someone stand on equal ground without wealth, without title, only truth. That's what they'll remember, not your challenge." A murmur rippled across the crowd. The senator who had smirked earlier now nodded, lips pressed in thought. The mayor's wife dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Even Richard's own board members exchanged glances, as if silently acknowledging that the foundation beneath their titan had cracked. Richard opened his mouth, but Elena lifted her hand gently, not to silence him rudely, but to remind him that he no longer dictated the rhythm of the night. "I don't need your offer, sir," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "But if you truly want to redeem this moment, then keep your word. You said I'd earn something if I succeeded. Honor that. Not for me, for the people who scrub your floors, polish your silver, and carry trays through your halls. The ones you don't see." Her words reached beyond him, into the bones of every servant lining the walls, every unseen hand that had made the gala possible. Heads lifted, eyes welled. Even the staff who had worked under Richard for years felt, for the first time, that their existence had been spoken into the light. Richard faltered. His empire was built on contracts and negotiations, yet he had no defense against truth spoken so simply, so directly. The silence stretched again, thicker now, charged not with awe but with judgment. Every second he delayed was a second his empire crumbled further. Finally, with a rigid nod, he forced the words. Very well, it was not generosity. It was not grace. It was survival. But the room heard it for what it was. Capitulation. Elena bowed her head once, respectful yet firm, and stepped back. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to linger. In that single moment, She had turned Richard's empire of intimidation into a stage for integrity. And the audience knew the billionaire had lost not to power or money, but to a waitress who refused to let him define her. The gala had not ended, but it had changed. The chandeliers still glowed, the champagne still sparkled in crystal glasses, and the orchestra softly resumed its playing, yet the room felt entirely different. The tension that had once hung like a chain around every neck was gone. In its place was something gentler, quieter, more human. Guests whispered to one another, but the usual talk of contracts and mergers was absent. Instead, the murmurs carried words like extraordinary, humbling, and necessary. Elena remained by the piano, no longer the waitress in uniform, but not yet a star either. She was simply herself, a woman whose truth had filled the room so fully that no chandelier could outshine it. A young violinist from the orchestra approached timidly, clutching her instrument. She was barely 20, her eyes wide. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice trembling, "the way you played is what I dream of. But more than that, the way you stood. I want to be like that." Elena placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, her touch steady, motherly. "Then don't let anyone tell you where your worth begins or ends. Not even someone with the loudest voice in the room." The violinist nodded, tears brimming, and hurried back to her seat with a fire in her eyes. Across the hall, an elderly woman, one of the long-time patrons known for her sharp tongue, rose with difficulty from her chair. She walked slowly toward Elena, leaning on a cane, her pearls clinking softly. When she reached her, she took Elena's hand with both of hers. "My dear," she said in a voice raspy with age but clear with conviction, "you reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago. That dignity isn't bought. It's lived." Elena's smile this time was warm, genuine. "Thank you." The old woman gave her hand a squeeze before retreating. The exchange, small as it was, rippled outward, softening faces, shifting postures. And then there was Richard. He had not left. He could not. He stood apart near the head table, his jaw tight, his drink untouched. His empire had taught him to measure evenings in profit, in applause, in influence gained. But tonight, no measure served him. Instead, he was left with reflection. The humiliation was still raw, but beneath it, something unfamiliar stirred, an unease he could not dismiss. For the first time in years, his authority had been challenged, not by another titan, but by someone he had not even considered equal to stand in his gaze. And the worst part, perhaps the most freeing part, was that the challenge had not been loud or cruel. It had been simple, honest, human. His hand tightened around the glass, then loosened. Slowly, deliberately, he set it down, the sound of crystal against was small but final. He exhaled, as though releasing something he had carried too long. The mayor, seated beside him, leaned in and murmured, "Richard, she gave you a gift tonight, whether you see it or not." Richard did not answer, but he did not walk away either. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of something. Elena, meanwhile, stepped down from the platform, her shoes clicking softly against the marble. She did not seek the spotlight. She walked instead toward a line of servers by the wall, men and women in black and white uniforms, people who had blended into the background all evening. Straightened as she approached. One of them, a dishwasher still in his teens, whispered, "Miss Brooks, you spoke for all of us." She shook her head gently. "No, I spoke with you. Tonight they saw you too." For the first time in their lives at a gala like this, the staff smiled openly, not just in service, but in recognition. As Elena picked up her tray again, resuming the very task that had marked her as less only hours before, no one dared look at her the same way. Each guest who caught her eye now nodded respectfully, and when she placed a glass of water before an elderly patron, the patron whispered a heartfelt, "Thank you, Miss Brooks." It was the smallest thing, yet it was everything. The gala continued, but the night's story was no longer about Richard Whitmore's wealth or his guest grandeur. It was about the waitress who played a piano and reminded a room full of power that humanity cannot be bought, belittled, or silenced. And as the final notes of the orchestra floated to the hall, every guest carried the same aftertaste, the warmth of humility, the quiet echo of dignity, and the unsettling yet comforting truth that sometimes the smallest voice in a room is the one that lingers longest. The thunder of applause still lingered in the air when the murmurs began to ripple across the ballroom like an underground current. For a moment, the room was divided. Some continued clapping with shining eyes. Others leaned toward their neighbors, whispering in tones edged with disbelief. "Did you know she could play like that?" One woman in emerald silk asked her husband, her fan trembling slightly in her hand. He shook his head, eyes still glued to the stage. Impossible. She was serving drinks a moment ago. At the corner of the room, two young financiers who had laughed loudest during Richard's taunt now shifted uncomfortably, loosening their ties. "We might have misread her," one muttered, his voice low, as if the chandeliers themselves might overhear. Elena, still seated at the piano, placed her hands gently on her lap. She did not bow, did not smile. She simply sat in quiet dignity, as if the music had spoken enough. That stillness unnerved the crowd more than any triumphant gesture could have. It made them question their own silence earlier, why they had accepted mockery so easily, why they had watched without protest. An older gentleman, a retired judge whose voice still carried weight in elite circles, leaned on his cane and whispered to a woman beside him, "What you witnessed tonight isn't just talent. It's truth cutting through arrogance." His words, though spoken softly, traveled. Others leaned in, repeating fragments. Truth through arrogance, dignity unveiled, music as justice. In the far corner, the staff who had been invisible for years gathered by the kitchen doors. A dishwasher, sleeves still wet, whispered to a maid, "She made them see us." Not just her, us. For the first time, they felt the invisible wall between them and the glittering world of their employers crack just a little. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore sat stiff in his chair, jaw clenched, glass of brandy untouched at his side. He could feel the shift in the room like a tide turning against him. Where once whispers always flowed around his name, his deals, his parties, his iron grip over business rivals. Tonight the whispers belonged to Elena. She had become the center of gravity, and his authority bled away with every murmured word. He overheard fragments that stung more sharply than any insult. Richard underestimated her, made a spectacle of himself. Money can't buy that kind of grace. He pressed his palms together to steady himself, but the sweat gathering in them betrayed his unease. He had orchestrated hundreds of evenings like this one, where he controlled the narrative, where laughter bent to his will. Yet tonight, the story had slipped from his hands. A society columnist, notebook half hidden in her clutch, scribbled furiously. She had come expecting a gala recap of designer gowns and charity figures. Instead, she had stumbled upon a story that would ripple through the city by morning. Waitress humiliates billionaire with music. She scrawled, then paused, crossing out humiliates and replacing it with humbles. She knew words mattered. This was not about mockery returned. It was about dignity prevailing, and that framing would matter, too. By sunrise, it would not be Richard's challenge that people remembered. It would be Elena's quiet answer. The crowd began to reorient itself subtly, like sunflowers turning toward a new source of light. Guests who had smirked at Elena earlier now approached her carefully, with rehearsed smiles and outstretched hands, eager to be associated with her glow. A famous philanthropist took her hand gently, whispering, "The foundation would be honored if you perform at our next event." Others echoed, layering admiration as if to wash away their earlier dismissal. But Elena met each offer with calm restraint. She accepted no flattery too quickly, offered no promises, only small nods and measured words. She would not trade one form of performance, servitude, for another dress in gilded applause. She wanted them to sit with the discomfort a little longer. Somewhere deep in his chest, Richard felt the ache of that truth. He realized that no matter what he said now, his words would sound hollow. The room no longer waited for him to define the night. It had already been defined, not by wealth or spectacle, but by a woman who once carried trays and now carried a story larger than his fortune. The whispers continued to spread, delicate yet devastating. Elena had shifted from background to center stage, from invisible hands to undeniable presence. And with each retelling, Richard's authority cracked further, like porcelain under a hairline fracture spreading unseen. By the next morning, New York did not wake to headlines about charity totals or glamorous gowns. It woke to Elena's name, though few had known it before, and to the story of the waitress who silenced a billionaire with music. The Society columnist piece spread like wildfire across digital feeds. Quiet dignity at the grand gala. Waitress's piano triumph over arrogance. It was more than an article. It was a spark. Within hours, other outlets picked it up. Online forums buzzed. Hashtags trended. Hashtag piano justice. Hashtag silent strength. Hashtag dignity unveiled. Clips began to circulate. Guests had secretly recorded fragments of the performance on their phones. Grainy though they were, the shaky videos captured the essential truth. Elena's hands flowing across the keys, the room frozen in awe, and in the background Richard Whitmore, unmoving, glass untouched, eyes burning. At first, the upper circles tried to contain it. A PR assistant drafted statements about a delightful surprise performance that added color to the evening. But the narrative had slipped out of their control. Too many eyes had witnessed. Too many ears had heard. Too many hearts had been moved. Morning talk shows replayed the clips, anchors leaning forward with gleaming eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to see this. A billionaire challenges a waitress, and what happens next left the room breathless. Call-in lines lit up. Ordinary people weighed in with personal stories of being underestimated. She spoke for all of us, said one caller. I've worked my whole life being overlooked. Watching her, it felt like justice, but in a way no court could give. By noon, the story reached beyond the city. Articles appeared in London, Paris, even Cape Town. What had begun as whispers in a ballroom now stretched across oceans. And with each retelling, Richard's name shrank while Elena's grew. He was cast not as the brilliant tycoon, but as a foil, the man who mocked only to be unmasked. For a figure who built his empire on control, the loss of narrative was devastating. Meanwhile, within the staff quarters of the hotel, workers huddled around their phones during breaks. They replayed Elena's music again and again, tears welling as they whispered, "She carried us all on those keys." One dishwasher posted on social media, "For once, the world sees us. For once, we're not invisible." It went viral, shared millions of times. Even boardrooms were not immune. At a lunch in Uptown, a group of executives, Richard's peers, watched the clip in strained silence. Finally, one said, "He's lost something you can't buy back. Respect." Another nodded grimly, and the market listens when respect falters. Richard himself avoided the papers that morning, but the notifications on his phone were relentless. He turned them face down, only to hear his own name whisper in the streets outside his car window. That billionaire embarrassed himself. For Elena, the world tilted in a new direction. She was still a waitress on the payroll, still wore the same black uniform and white apron. But when she stepped into the dining room, heads turned, not with dismissal, but with searching eyes, some apologetic, some reverent. Guests who once handed her trays without thanks now stumbled over words, suddenly aware of their manners. She moved as she always had, measured, calm, dignified. Yet inside, she felt the weight of something larger. Her music had escaped her hands and entered the world. It was no longer just notes. It was a mirror held up to power, and the world could not look away. By evening, an editorial in a leading paper declared, "What happened at the Whitmore Gala was not entertainment. It was revelation. True wealth lies not in assets, but in grace. And grace is not for sale." The ripple effect was undeniable. Elena's dignity had become a public treasure, and Richard's authority, once unshakable, now bore visible cracks. The story had transcended the gala. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked, silenced, or underestimated. That night, when the city still buzzed with Elena's name, Richard Whitmore shut himself inside his penthouse. Curtains drawn, phone silenced, television dark. Yet the silence offered no refuge. It echoed with the same music that had haunted him in the ballroom. Every note replayed in his mind, not as melody but as accusation. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline stretched endlessly, but for the first time in years, he felt small against it. Usually, the city mirrored his power. Towers of glass, lights burning because of his decisions, his money. Tonight, it all felt fragile, as though the buildings themselves tilted toward a woman who owned nothing but grace. He replayed the scene in his head. His mocking words, the laughter of the guests, Elena's steady gaze. He had expected fear, perhaps tears. Instead, she had given him silence, and then music. Music that stripped him of his armor in front of everyone who mattered in his world. On the marble counter lay the morning's paper. He had tried to avoid it, but even face down, the bold headline seemed to shout at him. Waitress humbles Whitmore at gala. He turned it over at last, hands trembling not with rage but with something rarer, shame. For years, Richard had crafted his identity as unassailable. Every boardroom bowed, every deal tilted in his favor. He silenced rivals with money, lawsuits, or sheer force of personality. But this was different. Money couldn't buy back the way people looked at him now, the way even his allies smirked when they thought he wasn't watching. Respect was bleeding out of him, and no contract could stop it. He closed his eyes and, against his will, thought of his mother, a pianist herself, long gone now, who had once told him as a boy, arrogance deafens the ear. Humility lets you hear the music. He had laughed at her then, a child already rehearsing cruelty. But last night, hearing Elena play, the words struck like lightning. He had not only mocked a woman, he had mocked everything his mother once tried to teach him. The whiskey burned down his throat, but the ache inside remained untouched. He saw his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, lines carved by years of power games. For the first time, he did not see a conqueror. He saw a man cornered by truth. The phone buzzed again. Messages from PR advisors, lawyers, friends. Some urging him to get ahead of the story, others to crush it with money. He let it buzz until the sound felt like a drill in his skull. Finally, he hurled the device across the room. It hit the wall, shattering. In the ringing quiet that followed, Richard whispered aloud, a sound almost foreign to him. What have I done? The words did not erase his empire, nor mend the fracture in his reputation. But they marked something rare, acknowledgement. A billionaire who had always measured losses in dollars was now confronted with a debt no bank could calculate. The debt of dignity he had stolen, and the respect he had squandered. He poured another drink, then stopped, staring at the glass. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he set it down untouched. For once, he realized drowning wouldn't help. What he needed was reckoning, not with the press, not with his board, but with himself. And as he sat in that vast, lonely penthouse, he understood the cruelest irony. Elena had not humiliated him. He had humiliated himself. Long after the gala lights dimmed, Elena returned to her modest apartment tucked above a laundromat in Harlem. The night air carried remnants of perfume and car exhaust, but her world smelled of soap and warm bread from the bakery downstairs. She closed the door softly behind her, the weight of the evening finally slipping from her shoulders. Her small upright piano, tucked into a corner by the window, greeted her like an old friend. The wood was scratched, the keys yellow with time, but had been her refuge since she was a girl. She sat, fingers hovering, not to impress or prove, but simply to exhale. Soft notes drifted out, quieter than the thunder she had unleashed at the Whitmore Gala. This was not for the world. This was for herself. As her hands moved, she felt the tension in her chest ease. Memories came. Her grandmother humming spirituals while braiding her hair. Her mother whispering, "Never let them silence your song." The music became prayer, not performance. It reminded her who she was, not just a waitress mocked before high society, not just a woman who stunned them, but Elena, granddaughter, daughter, survivor, and dreamer. A knock startled her. She opened the door to find two of her fellow staff members from the gala, Janice, an older maid with silver streaks in her hair, and Carlos, a dishwasher barely out of high school. They stood there, awkward but determined, each holding small gifts, a bouquet of daisies bought from a street vendor, and a folded note scribbled in shaky handwriting. Janice's voice cracked as she spoke. We just wanted to say thank you, Elena, for what you did, for all of us." Carlos handed her the note. Inside, in simple block letters, it read, "You made us proud." Elena's throat tightened. She wasn't used to praise. Her world was built on invisibility. But tonight had shifted something not only for her, but for everyone who scrubbed, polished, and served without being seen. The three of them sat around her little table, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. They laughed at small things. The clumsy way Carlos had almost dropped a tray during the gala. Janice's sharp mutters about those snobs in gowns who can't even balance a glass. Yet beneath the laughter was reverence. They had watched her transform mockery into music, humiliation into triumph. In her, they saw their own silenced dignity lifted. Later, after they left, Elena returned to her piano. The daisy stood in a chipped vase on the sill, catching moonlight. She touched the keys again, this time smiling. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Her music had not only defended her, it had given voice to every quiet hand, every bowed head, every unseen soul in that glittering hall. And in that humble apartment, far from chandeliers and marble floors, Elena found her truest stage. The silent, sacred space where resilience turned into melody and where dignity, once mocked, shone brighter than any spotlight. 2 weeks had passed since the gala, yet the ripples still spread. Newspapers replayed the story, social media buzz, and late-night hosts delivered punchlines at Richard Whitmore's expense. Elena, however, tried to slip back into routine, serving tables, polishing glasses, and disappearing into her music at night. But nothing was quite the same. Guests glanced at her differently, some with admiration, others with curiosity. The invisible waitress had become a quiet legend. One rainy afternoon, Elena was leaving the hotel after her shift, umbrella in hand, when she noticed a man standing by the side entrance. At first, she thought it was just another guest waiting for a car. But then she recognized him, Richard Whitmore, alone, without his entourage, his suit dampened by the drizzle. For a moment, instinct told her to walk past. After all, what could he want? But something in his posture stopped her. The man who once commanded rooms now looked smaller. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low, stripped of arrogance. Elena, just her name, but with a weight she had never heard from him before. She gripped her umbrella tighter. Mr. Whitmore, I owe you more than an apology, he began, eyes fixed on the wet pavement rather than her face. What I said that night, it wasn't just cruel. It was cowardly. You didn't deserve it. None of you ever did. The rain pattered between them. Elena studied him carefully. His words were halting, awkward, yet not rehearsed. She could see the strain of pride wrestling with shame. This was not the commanding billionaire of the ballroom. This was a man fumbling toward something unfamiliar. Humility. You can't undo what you said, she replied evenly. But you can decide who you'll be tomorrow. Her calmness struck him harder than anger would have. Richard lifted his eyes at last, and for the first time in years, there was no mask of superiority, only weariness and a faint flicker of sincerity. He nodded slowly. You're right. I don't know if I can change all at once, but I want to try. If you'll let me, maybe you could help me see the parts of the world I've ignored. Elena said nothing for a long moment. The older might have scoffed, turned away. But something about this encounter, the rain blurring his expensive suit, the vulnerability in his voice, reminded her of her grandmother's saying, even stone can soften and waters flow. She gave the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that seeds, once planted, might grow. Richard exhaled, almost as if he had been holding his breath for years. He didn't ask for her number, didn't offer money, didn't try to reclaim dignity with grand gestures. Instead, he simply said, thank you for even listening, before stepping into the rain and walking away, leaving a silence that felt strangely lighter than before. Elena watched him go. Perhaps nothing would change. Or perhaps, beneath the weight of his empire, a crack had formed where light could enter. Either way, she felt no bitterness. Her music had done its work. And for the first time, Richard Whitmore had begun to hear it. Months passed. The city moved on to its next scandal, its next story. Yet in quiet corners, in kitchens and break rooms, in whispered conversations among those who polished silver and mopped marble floors, the memory of that night still glowed like a candle. Elena never sought fame. She continued her shift at the hotel, apron tied, hair pulled back, smile gentle but reserved. But something subtle had changed. When guests looked at her, their eyes lingered differently. Not with pity, not with dismissal, but with a quiet respect that had been absent before. For the staff, Elena had become more than a colleague. She was a symbol, Janice still told new hires about the night. Our Elena made them listen. Carlos carried his scribbled note, "You made us proud," in his wallet like a talisman. Even when exhaustion weighed on them, they remembered that dignity, though ignored, could never be erased. Richard Whitmore, too, was not the same. In boardrooms, he interrupted his own circle when they dismissed the voices of waiters or drivers. At charity events, he stood a little longer with the staff who poured the wine, sometimes asking about their families. It was awkward, often clumsy, and met with suspicion, but it was real. A man unlearning arrogance is rarely graceful, but he had begun. And Elena? On quiet Sunday evenings, she opened the community center's worn piano and played for children gathered on folding chairs. Some had parents who worked 2 jobs. Some carried burdens far beyond their years. But when her fingers danced across the keys, their eyes widened, their laughter rang, and for an hour, they were lifted. She taught them not just scales and notes, but the truth her grandmother had whispered. Music is a language of dignity. It tells the world you exist. Years later, those children would remember the woman who, with callous hands and a quiet smile, showed them that beauty could rise even from the most ordinary places. And perhaps one of them, just one, would carry that torch forward, playing not to impress, but to remind others of their worth. The gala had been only one night, but its echo lingered in hearts long after chandeliers dimmed. Because sometimes the most lasting revolutions are not written in history books or shouted from podiums. They are carried in melody and memory, in the simple courage of a woman who refused to let humiliation silence her song. And in that refusal, Elena left behind a legacy greater than applause. The reminder that music, dignity, and humanity belong to us all. And maybe that's the real lesson, not about pianos or galas, not about billionaires or titles, but about how one quiet act of courage can outlast 1,000 moments of cruelty. Long after chandeliers go dark and the applause fades, it's the memory of dignity, the kind that cannot be bought or mocked, that lingers, like the last note of a song that still echoes in your chest long after the music stops. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever seen someone's quiet strength change the way others saw them? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe dignity and kindness should always be seen, tap the like button so more people can feel this one too. Finally, if you'd like to walk with us through more stories of poetic justice, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss the next journey.